So it's almost the time of year where we're at the point where we only have a few weeks to go before it's the end of 2024. That means it's time to wind down, and it's also time to review the best emulators in 2024. There's going to be some really obvious choices, and there's going to be some surprises. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. And of course, let me know your thoughts and your favorite emulators in the comments below. I'll definitely have to check them out if I'm not familiar with them at this point. But without any further ado, let's jump right in. Now, the first emulator that I want to talk about undoubtedly has to be RPCS3. This emulator just continues to improve and get better over time. Now, 12 months ago when we reviewed RPCS3 on this 2023 episode, we said that compatibility was kind of 68%, and that has now seen an improvement to almost 70%. Now, that's only a small percentage of increases, but that does mean a lot more games are now playable. And the thing that we have to remember is we're slowly taking these smaller steps in order to improve the compatibility list. But getting that number to almost 70% is huge, and the team really needs to be congratulated for the continuing work. Now, the thing that I love about RPCS3 is that it really does enhance these games far beyond anything that was ever expected of them on the PlayStation 3. Now, the PS3, as we know, is a very complicated piece of hardware, and it has a lot of, quirks and things going on. And it does mean that sometimes some of these games have not run the best on original hardware. And the great thing about an emulator such as RPCS3 is that not only the community has stepped in and offered, patches to basically do things like unlock frame rates, but check this particular example that we're looking at here. This is Lollipop Chainsaw, and this particular game saw a recent remake or a remaster. I'm not sure what you want to call it, and unfortunately it wasn't, received very well. But if we go back to the original game on RPCS3 here, we can do things like tweak the frame rate. We can uncap the frame rate. We can enhance the visuals. And all of a sudden, we're running at 4K 60 frames per second, absolutely buttery smooth. And this is a transformative change. And this is something that many games have the ability to do. It's not only, related to a small subsection of games. Many games can be tweaked, they can be modified in order to get better fidelity, better frame rates, and overall a better experience. RPCS3 for me is an emulator that I simply can't live without. It's always on my desktop. It's always something that I like to mess around with and play games on. And that's not going to change. It is, for me, just the emulator that is continuing to kind of just surge forward in terms of what it can do. And if we think about it, if we think about what Sony actually has, what official response Sony would have to something like this, they don't have anything. And that really is a credit to the community and the developers themselves for continuing to support this emulator and just making it the best in class. Now, the other really cool part about RPCS3 is its online functionality, what is called RPCSN. And this is essentially a replacement for the PlayStation Network on the PlayStation 3. And with this, we can now start to consider playing games online. And games such as Tekken 6 is something that people are actively playing online. Check out this leaderboard here. And I was able to get into a couple of matches myself and play exclusively on RPCS3 without requiring the PlayStation 3. And having this online functionality just adds another dimension to an already beast of an emulator. And not only this, the team is working very hard to add or to revamp the save state support in the emulator. Save states are currently supported, but it is a pretty clunky process, as many of you probably know. And the team is already working hard to basically just revamp that. And by the time this episode comes out, who knows, that it may already be in place. But RPCS3 is, for me, the standout, and I love it. It's on my desktop. It's something that I can't simply live without. Now, the next emulator has been around for a long time, and that is the Wii U emulator, Cemu. Now, Cemu has become very important this year and has quickly kind of risen to the top as one of my favorite emulators of 2024, simply because the Nintendo Wii U, as we know it, is pretty much dead and gone. And that is because the Wii U eShop was obviously retired earlier this year. And it's made it a lot more difficult to enter into the Wii U ecosystem for the very first time. And something like Cemu, a very, very advanced and very mature Nintendo Wii U emulator, has been around for a long time, and it would definitely do the job for you. But once you've set everything up, it's an amazing experience, and once again can provide visual enhancements and fidelity improvements that go far beyond the scope of the original hardware itself. And the best part about Cemu in 2024 is that now that the Nintendo online services, or the online services for the Wii U, have been sunset, which means that we can no longer play online games on an official capacity, what makes Cemu so great is that it can fill that void nicely. Now, we did do a video earlier this year talking about Pretendo, which was the online replacement for the Nintendo Wii U and the 3DS. And this allowed us to continue to play online games on the Wii U, such as Mario Kart and various other games. Now, Pretendo is a great piece of software, and it's a great service. And I think if anyone wants to continue to play their games online via their 3DS and Nintendo Wii U, then Pretendo is definitely something that you want to check out. But the great part about Pretendo is that it also has hooks into Cemu itself. So if you take the appropriate files from your Nintendo Wii U, where you created your Pretendo account previously, and you copy those files over to the Cemu folder, you can use your Pretendo login and use these games online. And as you can see here, we're playing Splatoon online via Cemu with a 4K upscale at 60 frames per second. And this is absolutely incredible. The fact that we can play these games that no longer that you can buy. I mean, I can't buy Splatoon in any capacity anymore other than a used copy online, of course. And if you are someone that, wants to basically get your fix of online Wii U games, then Cemu and Pretendo is basically a match made in heaven. I've had so much fun going back and revisiting the Cemu emulator for you guys. It is an absolute powerhouse emulator. And look, I don't know what Nintendo's thinking when it comes to Wii U emulation specifically, whether that's something they're interested in taking down, such in the same way they did with the Nintendo Switch. And we will talk about Switch emulation later on in this episode, make no mistake about that. But for me, look, check out Cemu. It is a fantastic emulator with a lot of functionality, and just the online portion of it is really just the icing on the cake. Absolutely recommended. And one emulator that is definitely in my picks of the best in 2024. Now, when it comes to the Nintendo 64, things are very, very difficult because there are some really great N64 emulators out there, and a lot of them do a really great job. And some of them have good plugins where you can enhance visuals, you can enhance frame rates, and make things look razor sharp. The problem with emulating the N64 and offering some type of upscaling or upresing is that it does have artifacts, it does have texture issues, especially around when it comes to the 2D aspect of it, in terms of things like fonts and kind of, 2D billboarded sprites, for example. Some of those things don't translate very well when it comes to emulation on the N64 with, up-res visuals. So for me, when it comes to the Nintendo 64, often the simplest approach is the best. And for me, the best Nintendo 64 emulation, and the one that I always go back to, is Simple 64. Now, this particular emulator has been around for a couple of years as well, and it's a heavily modified version of Mupen 64 Plus, but it also includes the parallel RSP and RDP plugin. But this particular plugin is kind of baked into the emulator itself. And what this basically means is, this isn't the emulator for you if you want to have enhanced visuals or an uncapped frame rate, for example. But if you do want to have the very best Nintendo 64 emulation outside of, let's say, FPGA, then Simple 64 for me is hands down the one that you want to pick up, because it really offers the best out-of-box experience for N64 games outside of original hardware and FPGA. Now, the thing is, Simple 64 may not look like much, but this particular emulator is extremely compatible with many games that I throw at it. It also has things like Vulkan rendering. It supports the 64DD. There's also a full LLE boot process. It has instruction and data cache emulation. It also has accurate screen refresh and timings. Now, some other great things about Simple 64 is that it's automatically updated. There is a GUI, and some N64 emulators, they don't have the best user interface, but this one is very simple. There's not really much in terms of menu options and display options and things like that. Really, you just load the ROM and play. It also has NetPlay support, which is something I haven't tested, but I do believe that was added this year in 2024, and a lot of people are saying how great the NetPlay experience is on Simple 64. And also, and this is something that I think is the biggest thing for me, is that it also supports LibDragon. Now, you may not be familiar with what LibDragon is, but it is a homebrew Nintendo 64 SDK that allows homebrew developers to build their applications and test them. Now, in my experience, there's only 2 N64 emulators that can run anything that has been developed with LibDragon. One is Ares, the multi-system emulator that is very good, and of course Simple 64. Now, every other emulator that I've tried, such as Project 64, Mupen Plus 64, none of them work at all with anything LibDragon related. Now, this may not be a big deal if you just want to play N64 games, but if you are someone that wants to get into the Nintendo 64 homebrew community and build your own games, there is a very active community making games for the N64 using LibDragon and various other homebrew tools, then this is one of your only options. Look, Simple 64 is a fantastic Nintendo 64 emulator. It just works, and I think that's really the key thing that we're looking for when it comes to the Nintendo 64. So I definitely recommend it as one of my picks of the best emulators in 2024. If you had have told me a year ago that we would be playing Bloodborne on our PCs via PS4 emulation, I would have said that you were a liar. But Shad PS4 is the emulator that has really seen huge leaps and bounds in 2024. And this is the PlayStation 4 emulation. We have covered this on the channel previously this year. And look, this emulator continues to improve, and it just gets better and better every time I take a look at it. It wasn't even 6 months ago where we had footage of Red Dead Redemption booting into game, albeit very slow and very flickery. And now we're at the point where a game such as Bloodborne, you can almost play the entire game start to finish. Now look, this is still a very early and a very experimental emulator. There is a lot of work that's being done, and there are a lot of people that are very much interested in how PlayStation 4 emulation is going. And Shad PS4 really has had a stellar year. And look, the compatibility of this emulator is still quite low, but we're at the point where there is a lot of investigation, a lot of discovery, and a lot of things going on. But the wins that we're starting to see are really significant. Not only is Bloodborne running, this is obviously the most well-known of the games that are booting and running in Shad PS4, there are many other high-profile games that are slowly starting to get in-game now. And look, 2024 for Shad PS4 was a massive year, and I think it's only going to improve into 2025 and beyond. Now look, I'm super hyped about the future of PlayStation 4 emulation and Shad PS4. On their website, there's already kind of teasers of some of the new games that are starting to become playable and get into games such as The Last Guardian, which is one of those games that obviously is tied to the PlayStation 4, and we would definitely love to see that running on emulation with enhanced frame rates and enhanced visuals. So it's been a stellar year for the team at Shad PS4. This is one of the emulators that is going to get a lot of exposure over the coming years. I think it's the most exciting thing that's happening in emulation right now. There are a couple of other things as well, but I couldn't have a best of emulation in 2024 without Shad PS4. There's just been so much really good stuff coming from the team, and I can't wait to see what happens in 2025 and beyond. So hats off to the team, and it's definitely one of my picks of the best emulators that I played this year. PCSX2 is the PlayStation 2 emulator that runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and this particular emulator has seen a huge update in 2024, all thanks to PCSX2 version 2.0. Now, if you're someone that follows the nightly updates, this is not really something that is new information. You're probably already aware of this, but for those people that kind of, have a passing interest in PS2 emulation, the update to PCSX2 this year, earlier in the year, the version 2 update brought so many new enhancements to the table that really we need to talk about. And the first one is obviously the GUI change, where it went from WX widgets to Qt. And essentially what that means is, for those people that aren't familiar with the different UIs, implementations that you can provide, it is just a much better user experience. And I think most people really like how PCSX2 operates as compared to the old days, where it was very, very clunky and just very difficult to kind of get around. And not only this, PCSX2 has also done away with its old plugin system. Now, plugins did have their place, in the earlier days of emulation, where developers outside of the core emulation authors could build their plugins and then bundle them with the emulation itself. And this kind of worked quite well for something like Nintendo 64. But for the PlayStation 2, it was something that just didn't really quite work in the same way. So PCSX2 has also seen the removal of the plugin system. Everything is kind of built in, so there's really no reason for the end user now to chase down plugins or find a plugin that is suitable for the game that they're trying to play. Everything just works, and that means it makes things so much easier to use. But for modders, there's also a very, very important texture replacement functionality that's in place, which means that now we can start to mod various games. And I've seen the community already start to apply mods and texture enhancements to various games such as Gran Turismo 4, for example. There's also various fixes to some long-standing games that have had issues. Games including Burnout and Ratchet & Clank and Destroy All Humans. Ace Combat has also seen some updates as well. And the last word has to be the compatibility list. We're at 98% of all PS2 games are now considered fully playable in PCSX2. We're talking over 2,667 titles. And really, it's more difficult nowadays to find a game that doesn't work properly in this emulator. So hats off to the team. They're doing an amazing job. I'm so psyched about what they've done this year, and I can't wait to see what's happening in 2025 and beyond. Now, Atari Jaguar isn't really the first system that I think about when I put on the best emulators of 2024 list, but we have to talk about the BigP emulator that's been developed by Rich Whitehouse. Now, a lot of people last year were asking me why I didn't talk about BigP last year, but I did want to give it some more time to get a little bit more fleshed out and more mature. And here we are in 2024, and I am putting BigPEmu into the best of 2024 list, because if you are a fan of the Atari Jaguar, or even if you're not, but you are someone that wanted to get into the Atari Jaguar but didn't really know where to begin, because getting into the Jaguar is something that is not really easy to do. The hardware itself is pretty pricey to buy, and the emulators over the years have been okay, but they haven't been particularly great. But everything has changed now thanks to BigP. Now, BigP can run the entire gambit of Atari Jaguar games, the complete retail library, and has support for much of the homebrew scene as well. Now, the emulator itself is extremely accurate and extremely compatible, and it also has the ability to overclock and underclock games, which means that some games, such as Tempest 2000, as you can see here, run so much better than the original hardware. Now, this doesn't always work with all games, but there are a lot of settings that you can tweak to get a better experience than the original hardware itself. And according to the website, it allows you to play many Atari Jaguar games at 60 frames per second for the very first time. It also has modern shader support and things like save states and rewind functionality. This is a fantastic emulator. There's also per game profiles that you can use. There's also multiplayer functionality, which means that if you do want to play online multiplayer Alien vs Predator, then you can absolutely do that. There's also Jaguar VR support, which is not something that I've personally used myself, but this particular emulator is exceptional. It has so many features, not only for the end user, the enthusiast, it also means that people that want to get into the Jaguar for the very first time can certainly do that very, very easily with BigP. It doesn't require you to download any official Atari BIOSes or anything like that. It has its own built-in HLE implementation of the BIOS functionality. This is really just an emulator that does just work out of the box, and a huge credit to Rich Whitehouse for the BigP emulator. It's fantastic. It's one of the best I've seen in a very long time, and it's something that the Atari Jaguar desperately needed. I know in the past there's Virtual Jag and other emulators that have done a pretty decent job, but this one is the only Atari Jaguar emulator that you need. And I believe as of the making of this episode, there is a iOS version that's on the App Store as well that you can download and play as well. So that's pretty awesome to see. But fantastic job, BigP emulator. And I can't wait to see what 2025 and beyond brings to this amazing emulator. Now, the last emulator that makes the best of 2024 list has to be Vita 3K, which is the PlayStation Vita emulator that runs on Windows, Linux, macOS, and Android. Now, Vita 3K has once again seen some amazing updates in 2024. And at the end of last year, we were sitting at about 55% of all Vita games as considered playable, which means, start to finish with playable performance and no game-breaking issues. Now, that number in 2024 has risen to just under 60%. And this, while it seems like it's not very much in terms of the additions, we're talking about 1,326 playable games on the PlayStation Vita via this emulation. And this is very, very awesome to see. PS Vita is something that has had some difficulties over the years with its emulation, but over the last 18 months or so, Vita 3K has really just gone leaps and bounds in terms of its progress, and I'm very, very encouraged by what we're seeing. There's been so much work being done in the back end to really enhance and improve the compatibility of all the games. And of course, there's been just some additional point releases. There's updates that happen pretty much every few days. There's an update to Vita 3K that just adds a little bit more compatibility, some game fixes here and there. But I am happy to see Vita 3K constantly receiving updates. Now, one of the great features of Vita 3K is its upscaling support. And this really means that the Vita internal 544p resolution can be enhanced significantly, and this can make games look so much better. And not only this, there is support for the Vulkan backend and the OpenGL backend, which was in place previously, and upscaling can be done on both of these renderers as well. There's also better shader support and better what is known as shader interlock, and this means that games such as Soul Sacrifice now have less flickering. And there's just been some fantastic compatibility updates that have been done as well to make sure that the compatibility database is kept up to date. Vita 3K is an absolutely stellar emulator, and I can't wait to see what the team has in store for 2025. Hats off to the team, and keep up the amazing work. Now, it's fair to say that this year has been a very difficult year when it comes to emulators. Of course, I'm talking about the removal of Nintendo Switch emulators by Nintendo, both Yuzu and Ryujinx. Now, we have to be very clear about what this means, because a lot of people are saying that Nintendo is killing off emulation, and in one regard, that may be a true statement, but we have to remember that both of these emulators were removed by, outside of the court system. It wasn't a court-ordered thing that, Nintendo basically won in a court of law, and these emulators were asked to be removed by a judge. To be clear, both emulators went through what is known as a settlement process, and the settlement means that a judge was not asked to rule on a case. So the legal boundaries that emulation has and emulation developers have, they are still in place. The difference here is that we don't know if there was a violation of the DMCA. Now, Nintendo claims that there was, and basically they flexed their corporate muscle around, sending lawyers out and scaring emulation developers into basically going into hiding and removing their emulators from, their GitHub repositories. But until this particular issue is tested in a court of law, then we can still say that emulators are 100% legal. Now, the other thing about Nintendo Switch emulation is even though Yuzu and Ryujinx are gone, they're still being developed and they're still being maintained. And this is why open source is so important, because once you open source your software or your code, then it's available everywhere. I saw some interesting reports that Nintendo now owns Ryujinx and the Ryujinx domain and the Ryujinx source code. That is simply untrue. Open source means that no one has ownership of that code. And ultimately, it means that even though there was a huge blow to the Nintendo Switch emulation community this year, it doesn't mean that things are dead and gone. And I think we'll continue to see more updates in 2025 and beyond. But we're going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Let me know your favorite emulation and emulator picks of 2024, what they are, in the comments below. I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say on this. But we're going to leave it here. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this episode, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye for now.